It's good to have everyone back again this afternoon. And our first presenter this afternoon is Steve Kershaw. Steve is a classical scholar who writes and lectures on both Greek and Roman topics. He lectures widely, including at the Victoria and Albert Museum and the Oxford University Department for Continuing Education, both of which, of course, Cathy Oakes worked at. And Steve is also a professional musician. You can find his music online. The title of his presentation is Metope North 32 on the Parthenon, False Virgins and Cultural Vandals. Over to you, Steve.
Thank you very much indeed. Let's hope that's working. That seems good. No, thank you very much indeed. And it's a great honour to do this in honour of Cathy. Because a few years ago, I was taking a group of students to Athens as part of a beautiful teaching assignment that I very much owed to Cathy Oakes and her various connections, some of whom are here today. Cathy was a wondrous facilitator, I think, a great catalyst. She made lots of wonderful things happen. And a number of things that have been very important in my life and my teaching and professional life, V&A, Oxford, and so on, I owe to her very deeply. We first met actually lecturing for Swan Hellenic Cruises back in the day. That's where it all bounced off from. And as I was here in Athens with these beautiful people here on the screen, of course we had to study the Parthenon. And we also went to the Acropolis Museum, and on special display there was this Metope North 32 from the Parthenon, which had recently been taken down from the temple, placed in the museum, and given a degree of conservation treatment. It's a wondrous piece. And it was accompanied, though, by a piece of signage, which really worried me. Here it is on the screen. And the bits that I've highlighted in green, this assumption that the ancient world was in decline in 400 AD, and at the bottom that it was a given that, of course, the angel is Hebe and the Virgin Mary, her mother, Hera, struck me as possibly a bit presumptuous, but they're not really central to my real worries that I'd like to deal with today, which are the ones that are highlighted in red here. So knowing Cathy's expertise in matters Marian, I contacted her when we got back home, and my initial concern about this was the early date. How likely was it that Alaric's invading army, who had moved into Greece in 396, was a bunch of fanatics opposed to idols? What evidence is there that they attempted to burn the Parthenon and to destroy its sculptures? Was it them who brutally defaced the metopes on three sides of the building? Was it true that the 32nd metope on the north side was left intact? What was this archaeological research? And crucially, if the Goths had done all this damage, was the preservation of this metope due to the fact that the scene was thought to portray the Annunciation of the Virgin Mary? So those are my worries. And our exchanges that went to Cathy and beyond drew various interesting responses and took us in some very interesting directions. So a little bit of context. The Parthenon is a temple to Athena Parthenos, Athena the Virgin. It's crucial. It was constructed between 447/6 and 433/2 BCE. And every single one of the sculpted metopes, those rectangular panels at the top there, all 92 of them are sculptured. But drawings that were made in the 17th and the 18th centuries show that by that time, by the 17th and 18th centuries, those of the east, the west, and the north sides were very badly degraded. You're looking at the west here. However, those on the south, which are now mainly in the British Museum, seemed to have escaped any serious deliberate damage, and the internal frieze and the pediment sculptures appear relatively intact in comparison. So when did that defacement occur? Why was North 32 left unscathed? Indeed, was North 32 left unscathed? And could it have anything to do with the Annunciation and with Interpretatio Christiana? Well, sometime after Athens had fallen under Roman control, and this is centuries after the building was erected, a serious fire destroyed its incredible gold and ivory cult image and badly damaged the interior. But no text tells us when or how. We could go to the time of the Roman Emperor Gallienus, perhaps, who repelled an invasion by Goths and a Germanic people called the Heruli in the 260s, but not before they had sacked Athens. So maybe it could have been them, but there's nothing to suggest it. I mean, they certainly left archaeological evidence of the fire destruction elsewhere in Athens, but that's all we can say. And I think further evidence would be needed if we're going to definitely want to pin the blame on them. And neither, by the way, do we know who repaired the damage, if there was damage to repair at that particular time. Interesting question in itself. So those are sort of the 260s. Now, with the Edict of Milan in 313, we see official recognition of Christianity, but at that stage, Christianity doesn't really pose an existential threat to the fabric of the pagan Parthenon. But Theodosius I's edict outlawing pagan sacrifice and cult, initially issued on the 24th of February in 391, and that really changed that. That really changed the situation. And so, of course, did his final decree on the 8th of November in 392, which goes like this. So no person at all of any class or order whatsoever shall sacrifice an innocent victim to a senseless statue in any place at all or in any city. If anyone should dare to immolate a victim for the purpose of sacrifice or to consult the entrails, he shall be reported in accordance with the example of a person guilty of high treason. And this resulted in the closure and destruction of many temples and sanctuaries, probably including those of Zeus at Nemea. On the right, those columns that you see from the air have not been destroyed by an earthquake. It's too regular for that. That must have been deliberate. The same at Olympia here on the right. So now we have at least an atmosphere in which the pagan temples are potentially in considerable peril. And this creates what's sometimes called an argument from epochal suitability, in which the defacement of our relief would fit perhaps our expectations of the period in question. For me, though, I worried again about whether those expectations were justified. Well, Theodosius I's army included large numbers of Goths, actually, who were by now, in the main, Christians. And Ulfila, Little Wolf, the name means, who was made the bishop of the Gothic Christians in 341, had been important in their conversion to an Arian-slanted version of Christianity, the kind of thing that Teresa was talking about this morning. And among those Goths was this man Alaric. His name means Lord of all. And his fighting prowess helped Theodosius to lead his troops under the Christian labarum to a decisive victory over an overtly pagan usurper called Eugenius at the Battle of the River Frigidus, that's in modern Slovenia, on the 5th of September in 394. And Christian historians felt that perhaps the most high-profile casualty of that battle was actually paganism itself. But Theodosius didn't really get to see the fruits of his victory. He died early in the following year. And in the upheavals that followed, Alaric led his Goths on a rampage that took him into Greece, where he sacked Athens in 396. Rather beautifully illustrated here by Ludwig Tiersch as he lords it over the Athenians. So, my question here: did Alaric's Christian Goths ravage the Parthenon, and did they recognize Metope North 32, which is at the bottom right there, as the Annunciation and spare it? The damage to the other sculptures is evident, really. That's just a random selection of slides, but from the east, west, and other north parts of the building, these things are badly degraded and badly damaged. So, was the ancient fire caused not by pagan Goths in the 3rd century, that earlier generation, but by Alaric's fanatical neophyte Christian Goths who were opposed to idols? Was what the sign says, that brutal defacement of the metopes on 3 sides of the temple, concurrent with the fire? Question. Well, there's no account of the sack of Athens at all in perhaps one of the most important sources, which is the 6th century historian Jordanes, his Getica, his History of the Goths. And the pagan author Zosimus, in his New History, which was published in the 1st quarter of the 6th century as well, has this interesting account. He says that Alaric marched into Greece, he says, committing the greatest devastations on his way. But Athens, in the midst of these impious designs, was able to call to its aid the presiding deities by which it was preserved. When Alaric advanced against the city, he saw Minerva, Athena, its tutelar goddess, walking along the wall in armor, ready to attack those who opposed her. Alaric, being struck with awe by this sight, desisted from his attempt on the city and sent heralds with proposals for peace. These being accepted and oaths mutually exchanged, Alaric entered Athens with a small number of troops. There, he was entertained with all possible civility and treated with great hospitality, after which he received some presents and departed, leaving the city uninjured. Interesting. So you have a pagan historian spinning a tale of Alaric sparing Athens. However, there is archaeological evidence of destruction throughout the city, so the Acropolis could have been pillaged at that time. And the subsequent repairs could then have taken place in this context and not that of the previous Goths and Heruli. And certainly fragments of the fabric of the Parthenon have been found in an early 5th century CE wall of the Athenian Agora, which may have formed part of the restoration project, which was conducted perhaps by the Praetorian prefect Herculius, who was publicly honored by the Athenians. So what did they do? Well, the eastern entrance of the Parthenon was repaired. A new pedestal for a statue was installed, which suggests, interestingly, that the cult of Athena was still active at that point, despite imperial Christian hostility to it. Furthermore, the building's marble tiled roof, which had caved in the fire, was then replaced by a new terracotta one that covered the main chamber, the cella, but not the peristyle. So it left a kind of freestanding open-air colonnade around the main chamber. And if the chronology of that is correct, it would make the construction of the new roof and the subsequent later conversion of the temple into a church discrete events, neither of which would require, anyway, the erection of scaffolding on the exterior of the peristyle that might provide a platform for anyone who was seeking to deface the metopes. And again, it still leaves for me this question of why only the north, west, and east metopes are damaged and not significantly anything else. That still remains as another of my many worries. something else worries me too. Did these Goths, who were allegedly hacking away at the northern metopes, get to this one? Were they working in sequence? And did they get to this one? It's the last one on the northern side as you go left to right, at the corner with the west. Did they get to this one and recognize that scene on the screen as the Annunciation? In any case, how deeply embedded was it in Christian iconography in 396, before Alaric and the Goths had been to Rome themselves? Would they have exercised interpretatio Christiana at this stage? Well, certainly some think not. And they argue that the representations of the Virgin were unknown, or at least unpopular, prior to the Council of Ephesus in 431, where you get that game-changing moment where it's decided that the Blessed Virgin is going to be called Theotokos, the Mother of God, and not Christotokos, the Mother of Christ. However, others do see depictions of the Annunciation going back prior to Alaric. We have, for instance, this textile fragment that's in the V&A, which comes from a 4th century Christian burial in Egypt. And that shows the scene. Mary, over on the left there, is labeled in Greek. And the angel is there as well. And that seems to predate Alaric's sack. And prior to that, the catacombs of Priscilla in Rome have this scene, again painted on the ceiling of Cubiculum P, which is down in the lowest level of the catacomb. So what are we looking at there? Well, you've got a woman on the left. Let's say it's Mary, sitting in sort of 3/4 view on a chair, dressed as a Roman matron. Her hairstyle is a bit of a giveaway. She's rocking a look that's very fashionable with elite Roman women in the 2nd century. So it's kind of waved and parted maybe at the front with possibly you can see a ring of braids further back on her head, super fashionable in the 2nd century. There, some see a distaff under her left arm. And then on the right, you've got a wingless man, let's say it's the Archangel Gabriel, dressed like a Roman aristocrat, standing there, gesturing with his right hand, which could indicate that he's speaking. There is also, perhaps, a pre-Alaric Annunciation seen in the Domitilla catacomb and in the catacombs of Saints Peter and Marcellinus, and in the Via Latina catacomb, although in respect of the Via Latina one, the Pontifical Commission for Sacred Archaeology say that one has now been destroyed. But the point is, I think, that the catacomb scenes might show that the Annunciation was at least reasonably well known in Rome prior to Alaric arriving in Athens. That is, if these paintings show the Annunciation and simply not a, if you like, life of the deceased scene, and you're looking, in fact, at a scene of virtuous Roman man and wife here, which is also sometimes argued. But even, I think, if the non-Annunciation reading of the catacomb images is a valid one, it wouldn't really allay my worries about Alaric's itinerant Goths reading this metope on the Parthenon as the Annunciation. I can imagine later Christians seeing it that way. If you check out, for instance, the 4th or 5th century Pignata sarcophagus from which is in Ravenna, interesting compare and contrast. Triumphal Arch of Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome, another interesting compare and contrast, I think. This as well, rather nice 4th, 5th century Annunciation pilgrim token that's in the British Museum. So that's a possibility. So maybe it wasn't Alaric's Goths. Is it obvious? Not necessarily sure it is. Is it obvious that later Christians are the perpetrators because they spared the metope that reminded them of the Annunciation while they smashed up everything else? despite, I think, the mirror imaging of the scene and the absence of any obvious woolworking in the Parthenon metope scene, and the fact that the Parthenon metope scene, at least when it was intact, is a scene of two women and not a woman and a male. Certainly that the Christians did it but didn't do the metope North 39 is a very common view, worth exploring, I think, to an extent. So what happened? Well, sometime around 500 to 600, we don't know exactly when, the Parthenon became a Christian church. And that helped the building to survive because it was used, even though an apse was installed as part of the conversion to make it fit for Christian purpose. And for instance, the central block of the east frieze was found built into the Acropolis fortifications by Lord Elgin's workmen, and it's now in the British Museum. And this is beautifully illustrated in Thomas Hope's contemporary illustration of tea and tobacco, with people drinking tea and smoking tobacco in the shadow of the central piece of the Elgin marbles. But it wasn't removed from the building as an act of cultural vandalism by early Christians. I think it was simply due to architectural considerations and enlarging the apse of the building. And certainly by the 12th century, the Parthenon had become a very impressive church, and it was dedicated not to the Virgin Athena, but to another virgin, the Mother of God, Theotokos Atheniotissa. And as Michael Choniates, who was the last Byzantine bishop of Athens, said in his inaugural address in 1182, this Acropolis was liberated from the tyranny of the false virgin, the false Parthenos Athena. No longer is the fire on her altar fed sleeplessly. Now the ever-shining torch of the eternal Virgin, the eternal Parthenos, the Mother of God, the Theotokos, is held up on this peak as though from heaven itself. But even so, despite the switch of, if you like, patron virgins from Athena to Mary, the Parthenon never lost its pagan appearance, and the defacement of the metopes on the one hand should perhaps be offset on the other against the survival of the south metopes, the frieze, even though they punched some windows through it to at some point, and the pediments as well, which seem to have enjoyed, if you like, perpetual toleration. The Athenians walked into their church from where this photograph is taken. So underneath a plethora of pagan sculptural decoration that survived until it was removed to the Acropolis Museum in the first decade of this century. A really interesting process, I think. And so other candidates may come through for the defacement, including perhaps something that this man tells us, because in the 17th century, this guy, a Turkish traveller called Evliya Çelebi, he tells us a tale of the Fatimid Caliph, this man on the screen, nicknamed Al-Mansur, who ruled in the Maghreb from 946 to 953. The story of him conquering Athens, where he, quote, gouged out the jewel eyes of all the statues of the Parthenon and blinded them. Very interesting. However, there is no other written or archaeological evidence for a 10th century Arab sack of Athens. And the majority of the sculptures still seem to have remained intact throughout the periods of the Byzantine and the Frankish and the Ottoman rule, all of which provided, if you like, hundreds of years in which the sculptures could have been eradicated if anybody wanted to do that, if they felt it was desirable. And after the Fourth Crusade, Athens surrendered and was governed then by the Latin lords of Athens from 1205 to 1456. Firstly, the Franks, who called the Parthenon Notre Dame, Notre Dame d'Athènes, by Catalans and by Florentines, who built a tower in the Parthenon's west entrance porch. So for all we know, it could have been those guys who defaced the metopes, or not. The very first traveller that we know of to have made a drawing of the Parthenon, this is it, was Cyriac of Ancona. He was in Athens in 1436 and 1444. And in his drawing, there is no real hint of destruction. In fact, actually, there is no hint of the metopes because he just left them off at all here. So interesting there that we can't really use this very well. And then shortly afterwards, Constantinople fell to Mehmet II, the conqueror, in 1453, and Athens was taken by his general Omar in 1456. And at that point, the Parthenon became a mosque. And certainly the Ottoman rule certainly did some Greek sculpture no favors at all. We have an account by Ogier Ghiselin de Busbecq in the 16th century where he says this: some Turks came across a statue of an armed soldier of excellent workmanship and almost perfect, but with their hammers they soon reduced it to a shapeless mass. On our expressing vexation at this act of theirs, the workmen jeered at us and asked us if we wanted, in accordance with our customs, to worship the statue and pray to it. But as far as the Parthenon is concerned, actually, that chilling video is an ISIS thing. They're not actually smashing up real sculptures. They're smashing plaster casts in a way, fortunately. But as far as the Parthenon was concerned, the Turks don't seem to have done any more or any less damage than their Christian predecessors. And in the second half of the 17th century, the French ambassador there, a man called Nointel, hired an artist, often referred to as Jacques Carré, to make some drawings of the surviving sculptures, which he did, but not of the east, the west, and the north metopes, possibly because they were already badly damaged, so they escaped his interest. He certainly did fine drawings of the front. And it was fortunate that he drew what he did, because a little bit later, when the Ottoman and Venetian hostilities erupted, Athens came under siege in 1687, and a Venetian shell hit the Parthenon, as you can see here, where the Turks were storing gunpowder and destroying 28 columns and parts of the frieze. So how much damage was done to these particular pieces, again, we don't know, but the damage to the north metopes is definitely documented in these drawings executed by William Pars in the middle of the 18th century. He was in Athens in 1765-6. So here is his drawing on the left and what he was drawing from the north side metopes on the right. Similarly, his drawings here on the left of more of the north metopes. Sadly, his drawing of North 32 is on the other side. It's on the verso of that particular sheet, but you see how badly degraded they are. So that's his drawings. The one on the right is by Lord Elgin's artists, Sebastiano Ittar and Fyodor Ivanovich. That was made in 1801, 1802. So we know what it looked like then, and you can see it's damaged, but we can also now pinpoint whatever damage may have been done since. And now the North metopes reside safely in the Acropolis Museum, where my questioning began, that I needed to consult Kathy about. So where do we stand? Can we imagine in 396 Alaric shouting, "Oi, Atolf, put that sledgehammer down. Don't you know that's the Virgin Mary up there?" Overall, I think that's somewhat unlikely. And if Atolf or some other Goth was up there on the building, did he drop the hammer? Was Metope North 32 not damaged? Well, I don't think so. I mean, just look at it. The German, in the 1930s, the German archaeologist Gerhard Rodenwald certainly asserted that North 32 was spared because it was interpreted as the Annunciation. He wrote, "Not a single blow of the chisel touched it." But I don't see that. His work, I think, seems to be the source of the museum caption, but just look at it. It's very badly damaged. The heads of both figures have been knocked off, and their arms have been attacked, their feet have been assaulted and damaged as well. And even their identification is very difficult. There's no, of course, as the sign said, about them being Hebe and Hera. The right-hand figure has also been identified as Themis, Aphrodite, or Cybele, and the left-hand one also as Athena or even Pandora. I think simply we have two disfigured figures who look vaguely like Mary and Gabriel, if you really want them to. Maybe the Christians wanted to do that, but I'm skeptical. So to end, really, I simply do this. I hereby acquit Alaric and his Goths of religious fanaticism. I dissociate Metaphor North 32 from the Annunciation, and I contend that the right-hand figure is a false virgin, and I argue for damage by other and as yet unknown agents. And I thank you very much for taking the time to listen to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Well, we've already got one question has come through for you, but we'll go on to the next presentation and take all the questions at the end.
Thank you.
So I've got one or two as well. So the next presentation is by Richard Plant. Now, he's not showing on my screen at the moment. Let me find him. There he is. Well, Richard is the man who's keeping the show technically on the road today, so he's a very important man for us. He's a medieval architectural historian. He does work for the Victoria and Albert Museum, amongst many other august institutions. And he's a former Deputy Academic Director for Christie's Education. And the title of his presentation is The Reception of Sancta Maria Rotunda, Recent Interpretations and Open Questions.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And thank you to Sally for inviting me to speak in this rather wonderful day. And thank you, actually, on a slightly different note, to Andrea Worm for pointing me in the direction of and supplying me with some of the later images in this talk. So, the most famous building, dedicated to the cult of the Virgin is probably the Pantheon. And of course, it's folly to try to say anything about the Pantheon, the building which best combines celebrity and enigma, the Greta Garbo of the architectural historical world. It's also folly because so much has been said about it, and some of that has been said has so comprehensively been disproven. Until recently, discussions of the building began with a statement to the effect that, despite appearances, the building was built for Hadrian, a view now rejected by many in favour of a Trajanic date. Doubts about its original function, whether a temple or a rotunda, whatever that might mean, remain. None of these issues are really my problem today. My initial interest is in Christian architectural copies of the Pantheon, which is to say the Church of Santa Maria ad Martires, or Santa Maria Rotunda, as it's been known since the 7th century. There have been a number of relatively recent studies which have seen the Pantheon as a source for later buildings, and the purpose of this short talk is to summarize these recent investigations, but also briefly to look at the ways in which the Pantheon was perceived through the Middle Ages, a set of impressions with certain consistent themes. It's proved, unfortunately, difficult to link the two. Discussion of architectural copying leads inevitably to Richard Krautheimer, who set the ball rolling on Santa Maria Rotunda in a paper presented in 1950, which he described as a preliminary summary of a much more comprehensive study. The comprehensive study never materialized because, as Krautheimer notes in the postscript in his collected papers, he could not be certain of the precise dedication of many of the buildings he wished to include. His focus was on dedications to the Virgin in the company of saints or as Queen of Heaven. His criteria for including the rather disparate group of buildings he discussed in the article were that the buildings should be round, domed, surrounded by niches, and with a dedication to the Virgin. He brushes aside modern perceptions of dissimilitude by claiming that, to medieval men, this visual and mathematical correspondence was not the essential point. The mathematical part of that claim is especially surprising given his work on other buildings, the copy of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem at Paderborn, for example, in the introduction to the iconography of medieval architecture article, to which this Santa Maria Rotunda article forms a kind of pendant. The tradition of centrally planned buildings dedicated to the Virgin precedes the conversion of the Pantheon. There were alternative traditions, some perhaps only tangentially related to it. And the most famous surviving example in this group is probably the chapel at Arkhan, built for the Emperor Charlemagne from around the 800 and dedicated to the Virgin and the Saviour. This Krautheimer derived from Byzantine buildings, perhaps specifically from a long disappeared chapel in the palace at Constantinople of Hagios Soros, which housed a garment of the Virgin, as did the chapel at Arkhan, as does the chapel at Arkhan, perhaps I should say. Arkhan, of course, is in itself a much copied building, sometimes here, as at Sankt Maria im Capitol in Cologne, as a fragment of the elevation, easily recognizable and probably carrying it with it the association to the most famous local church dedicated to the Virgin, that is to say Arkhan, but also perhaps asserting the status of the abbess who rebuilt the church. She was of the Ottonian imperial family. Clearly in this case, visual correspondence was important, but the meaning is ambiguous or perhaps plural. Other half-known rotundae can also not easily be related to the Pantheon, not even those dedicated to the Virgin. The tomb of the Virgin near Jerusalem, at least in a 7th century description. The 6th century church of the Theotokos, you here, or I'm showing you the plan of here. And assuming it was originally dedicated to the Virgin, La Dorade in Toulouse from the 5th century. This tradition of centrally planned churches dedicated to the Virgin may have steered the choice of dedicatee for the antique monument, but can't have been determinate on it. However, not all rotundae can be associated with the Virgin. The church now dedicated to St. Gerion in Cologne and Ad Sanctos Aureus, to the Golden Saints in Gregory of Tours' account, is in form enough like an imperial mausoleum for some recent interpreters to posit that it was in fact designed for the tomb of Julian the Apostate. Further, Santa Maria Rotunda, shown in plan in the corner here, a most baffling building, and in a rather lovely view taken recently by John McNeill in the main picture. Sorry, where was I? Further, Santa Stefano Rotunda establishes a precedent of a sort for the use of a round building for a church, though its complex form is very unlike the Trajanic building. The Pantheon itself, as pagan temple, as building, as architectural wonder, whatever, is sometimes credited with inspiring domed late antique mausolea. And while this may be questionable, a certain congruence of forms may have been one factor in the additional dedication of the church to all the martyrs, as well as to the Virgin Mary. There is a further problem noted by Krautheimer. Association with the Pantheon could be applied post facto to buildings in no way related to it at their conception. The early 6th century mausoleum of Theodoric was later dedicated as a church to the Virgin, and in the 11th century was described as the Basilica of St. Mary in the likeness, ad similitudinem, of the Roman Pantheon. The building is a domed cylinder on top with a cruciform chamber below. The niches you can see here are external. The enthusiasm of the 11th century description in no way necessarily reflects the intentions of the builders or patron, but it does reflect the continuing charisma of the Pantheon and the strength of its association with the Virgin. So to turn to the buildings which Krautheimer did cite as copies, they're rather disparate in form, though mostly roundish. The Chapel of St. Mary at Sensula from the late 8th century, one at Würzburg of a similar date, one at Altotting near Munich, and also one from the 9th century at Ludwigstadt. The buildings are not easy to investigate, but archaeology has not been kind to the interpretation of the chapel at Sensula from the late 8th century, which has been revealed to have a hexagonal central core of 10 meters width, with a dodecagonal ambulatory and no niches. The Marion Chapel at Würzburg, which he took to be Carolingian, but which has had an amusingly wide range of dates attributed to it, is a niched rotunda, again small, and most reminiscent of an antique mausoleum, not the Pantheon itself. Now, a number of discussions of the Pantheon as a model start and sometimes end with these rather dubious examples. We have, however, recently moved on, and of recent suggestions I've encountered recently of copies of the Pantheon, the oldest building, I think, is the most unknowable. Attached to the I have too many long words in this talk. Attached to the Chrysotriklonos of the Palace of Constantinople was a chamber called the Pantheon. I know nothing of its appearance, beyond that found in Constantine Porphyrogenitus's Book of Ceremonies, in which it appears to be like a waiting room. The Chrysotriklinos was a primary throne room for the emperors, built by Justin II, who died in 578. Though whether the Pantheon was part of the ensemble from the start, I've not been able to find out, nor am I sure that the information is recoverable. More importantly, I have no idea why it was called the Pantheon. It may reflect some pre-Christian post-temple use of the Trojanic Rotunda. Imperial interest in the Pantheon before its consecration as a church is something, however, to which I will return. I also once heard Peter Kidson argue that the proportions of the Hagia Sophia were based on those of the Pantheon, and others have confirmed hearing the same thing. I haven't managed to work it out for myself, but since I'm very bad at discerning proportional relationships at the best of times, this perhaps reflects my failings rather than any reflection on the truth of the matter. It would certainly be appropriate for the greatest dome of Constantinople to be in some way related to that of Rome. In both these cases, we are dealing with a building from before the conversion into church. This perhaps takes us away from the theme of this day of the Virgin. The temptation to associate with the Pantheon, even in association with other sources, is strong. Thus, in discussing Bishop Wilfrid's late 7th century church of St. Mary at Hexham, Charles McClendon notes that descriptions from before its destruction claim it as being nearly round, built like a tower with porticus chambers on all four sides. This suggested to him a derivation ultimately from Santo Stefano Rotunda, which I showed you earlier in Rome, while the dedication and perhaps Wilfrid's spiritual interests pointed to the Pantheon. Caroline Malone, in assessing the rotunda at the east of the church of Saint Benin Dijon, consecrated in 1018, cited the Pantheon as a primary source, despite the galleries which run around the rotunda, which was at the east end of the church of around the year 1000. Many factors support this filiation. It has the same dedication to the Virgin and all the martyrs. It was consecrated on the same date, May the 13th. It is round, and it has or had an oculus, just dimly visible to you at the top here. Its diameter, furthermore, the full diameter, the same as its height. Malone seemed mildly surprised that a building which satisfied so many of Krautheimer's criteria should not have been discussed by him, as am I, but it is perhaps a little modern for his interests at the time. Her conclusions leave us with a wider problem of interpretation, however. There were many earlier axial eastern rotundi. Should we associate all with the Pantheon, or does the overdetermination of links to the Roman building signal a particular desire to evoke it, in this case in Dijon? Recent excavation in 2003 to 4 has uncovered the Marian Rotunda, described as Santa Maria Rotunda during the Middle Ages, at the west end of the Cathedral of Vic, part of an episcopal group of churches. The excavated remains shown here represent two phases of building. The earlier, consecrated by Abbot Bishop Oliba and consecrated in 1035, was a rotunda with an apse to its west of a diameter of 10.5 meters, which was reconstructed in the 12th century with the consecration in 1180, and that's the larger ring you can see here. This has been connected with Abbot Bishop Oliba's orientation towards Rome. Oliba was the most important churchman in Catalonia around the millennium, reforming the local church, but his interest in Marian Rotundae might not have been exclusively Roman or in the Pantheon. He also built at Kershaw a two-storied rotunda to the west of the church, which has a lower level rotunda, which was dedicated to the Nativity and the crib. For the next building, it's a still rather unthought through association based on details this time, and it is of the niches, it is of the Cathedral of Speyer, and in particular I wondered about these niches hollowed into the walls of the cathedral and screened by a column, and their possible sources, for which I was positing that these niches, fronted by two columns in the Pantheon, could act as some sort of source. I was rather encouraged a few months ago to receive an email from Malcolm Thirlby, which noted the similarity between the formation of the exedra, now used as the altar space in the Pantheon, and these altar niches which are found in the transepts at Speyer Cathedral, very atypical of the architecture of Speyer, including use of this entablature running around the top of the capitals and around the rear. The quotation seems unusually precise. It's something which needs a great deal more thought, but the German cathedral, sorry, I've jumped ahead in the slides, but the German cathedral is dedicated to the Virgin, and clutching at straws, it has a domical vault over the crossing tower. The final building in this short list derives from Paul Binsky's discussion of the Octagon at Ely, where, with due acknowledgement of Peter Kidson's comparisons of the effect of light on the two buildings, Binsky's clinching point is a comparison of height, which he describes as an heroic measurement, which indeed it is, hovering at around 43 meters in each building. He argued that the Pantheon's height is easily ascertained because it's a hemisphere, though as we shall see, measuring the Pantheon has sometimes been problematic. That both buildings are devoted to a Virgin, in the case of Ely to Etheldreda, though the Virgin Mary had become a co-dedicatee of the cathedral by the time the Octagon was built. Binsky is rather welcoming of the Pantheon as a prototype, noting Marvin Trachtenberg's argument that the baptistry of Florence was also scaled to match the Pantheon. Trachtenberg's argument is perhaps less conclusive, deriving from the units used to scale the building in general. Each external facet of the Octagon of 24 Florentine braccia is a third of the height of the Pantheon, and a third, it seems, of the external height of the building, including the lantern and the orb and the cross on top of it. In the favor of this explanation, however, we might note that a tradition grew up that the baptistry was, like the Pantheon, a pagan temple converted to Christian use. Binsky asserts that citation was in no sense historicism, but the recognition of an ever-present and still present authority which might or might not correspond to antiquity. As we will see, with the Pantheon, antiquity remains crucial, but this leads us to wonder about the perceptions of the building through the Middle Ages. It is now, of course, a top tourist site in Rome, and apart from the volumetric astonishment, the most striking thing about the building is perhaps the survival of so much of its ancient marble, and you can see around the interior not only the columns, but large quantities of the revetment, survive from the 2nd century. The preservation of the building is probably thanks to its conversion to a church. The revetment, however, one might have expected to be entirely stripped, either before or after the conversion, while a mosaic was added, not this one, into this apsidal niche. The decoration of the church still advertises its origin rather than being covered in Christian imagery. Its dedication to the church in either 609 or 610 is recorded in the Liber Pontificalis. Pope Boniface IV asked the emperor focus for the temple called the Pantheon, and in it he made the church of the ever Virgin St. Mary and all martyrs. To this church the emperor presented many gifts. This suggests the building was in some way imperial property, as was the case with the previous instance of imperial permission being sought for the church of St. Cosmas and Damian. The involvement of focus, though, is surprisingly often repeated. The frequently used appellation Santa Maria Rotunda seems to have been common from the middle of the 7th century. Dedication would have required relics, and though the legend of 28 carts of martyrs' bones being brought from the catacombs is apparently a much later invention, it may have been accompanied by the installation of this icon, which partially survives. When complete, this was an image of the Virgin standing and a full 240 centimeters in height. The image is generally, but not always, dated to the time of the consecration, and in a way would have effected that consecration. The hand of the Virgin was once gilded. The Pantheon thus became a papal church, used in stational liturgy, with masses said there on the anniversary of the consecration, the 13th of May, which also was instituted as the Feast of All Saints, on Easter Friday, and in a probably rather cold ceremony on the 1st of January. Later in the Middle Ages, on the Sunday between Ascension and Pentecost, the Pope preached on the descent of the Holy Spirits, and roses were dropped from the oculus. Otherwise, it must have remained problematic for liturgical use, having this large hole in the roof, and we know little of the dedication of any subsidiary altars, which is most frustrating for our understanding of what was understood by the Pantheon at the time it was copying. We're left then with medieval accounts of the building and the occasional representation. Evidently, it retained its position as one of the wonders of Rome, being foregrounded in this famous depiction by Cimabue of Italia, and indeed foregrounded on this golden bull from 1320 issued by Ludwig of Bavaria. Perhaps most interesting are these pilgrim badges, one found in London, this one, and the other found in the Netherlands, seated in these instances, unlike the icon, and within the building, which is unusually prominent for this type of object, and which has the dome and its oculus very clearly emphasized. The inscription reads Signum Sanctae Mariae Rotundae, and in a sense, one gets the feeling that what is being made pilgrimage to generate these badges is not some relic or the icon, but the building itself. Medieval descriptions repeatedly stress that the building was once a temple, its consecration, and the former presence of demons. So, beginning with Bede, Pope persuaded the Emperor Phocas to give the Christian church the Roman temple anciently known as the Pantheon, as though it were emblematic of all the gods. After solemn purification, Boniface consecrated it as the Church of the Holy Mother of God and all the Christian martyrs. And once its company of devils had been cast out, it became a memorial to the company of saints. Master Gregorius, in the later 12th century, describes it thus: I shall only briefly mention the Pantheon, once the idol house of all the gods, or rather of all the demons. This building is now a church dedicated in honor of all the saints, though it is generally called Santa Maria Rotunda. Gregorius claims to have measured it with an inaccurate width of 266 feet, unless he had very small feet. The tale attached to the construction of the building in the slightly earlier Mirabilia Urbis Romae, is one of divine inspiration. In this case, Cybele appears to Agrippa in a vision, offering him victory in Persian wars if he built a temple to her and to Neptune, to whom the often overlooked building to the rear of the Pantheon seems to have been dedicated. For the rededication, the author is clear that the replacement of the mother of the gods, Cybele, was by the mother of the saints, Mary, and also that the temple of Cybele had caused many Christian men to be stricken by devils. And this overcoming of the demonic and the triumph over paganism through the consecration of a pagan temple to the Virgin is then a recurrent theme. It appears in the Golden Legend, in which the Pantheon is described as higher and more marvellous than the rest, and that the foundations were laid in a circle to signify the eternity of the gods. Demonic infestation also features in the 1452 description of Nicholas Muffle. A well-known tale of the Virgin overcoming the devil is associated with the Pantheon in a sermon encouraging pilgrimage to the Cathedral of Amiens, recently published by Stephen Murray. It's the story of the clerk Theophilus, who had signed a contract with the devil to secure his own advancement, but passing one Saturday in front of the church of Santa Maria Rotunda, heard the glorious service, sought redemption from the Virgin, and was released from his contract. It is, I'm pretty sure, a coincidence that the Cathedral of Amiens, higher at the time and still the most marvellous of Christian temples in France, is also the first to approximately match the height of the Pantheon at 43 meters. I'll close with this image from a commentary on the Apocalypse by Alexander of Bremen, specifically a commentary on Revelations 11:13, illuminated in the late 13th century in Cologne. The cast of characters is assembled. Here on the right is the Emperor Phocas, identified by inscription, and in the center, here is Boniface conducting the dedication of the church, and the demons are being cast out. In the manuscript as a whole, it forms an unusually dense section of images, preceded by images of the Virgin and succeeded by preachers on the theme of Dives and Lazarus. From these scattered comments, which I've assembled, the ancient pagan legends of the building remain an essential feature of the Pantheon. Its association with the demonic might be partly because of its improbable structure, but it also comes to signify the triumph over paganism and the devil through the agency of the Virgin Mary. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Richard. We've heard two excellent presentations on buildings and their possible transformation from pagan to Christian use, with lots of excellent detail. And we've got questions about both of them, but before we come on to those, we'll have our third presentation of this session. This is Eileen Rubery. Eileen, I know as a woman of many skills. She was introduced to me by Kathy, I think, first of all. That's how we both first got to know each other. Eileen is a medical doctor with a PhD in medical science, and she's also got qualifications in business studies, as well as in art history. And I know her as someone who has done an enormous amount of research on the Marian iconography of medieval Rome and has identified, drawn attention to a lot of very interesting points and important questions. Her presentation this afternoon is called The Virgin Mary, is called Crowned in Glory, the Virgin Mary Enthroned. So over to you, Eileen.
Thank you very much. That's very kind of you. I'm really looking forward to I've been looking forward very much to this talk and hearing everybody else's report. And I have to say it's been a most interesting one with some very interesting suggestions from various people. Excuse me. Can I just see if I can get up my image of myself? Can everybody hear me okay? Are you able to hear me at the moment?
I can hear you.
Great, okay, that's lovely. Okay, the interesting thing from sitting through the lectures today has been the difference in colour related to the Virgin Mary from my perspective. In that most of my images come from areas where they've been painted or where they've been decorated or where the clothes are tremendously bright and cheerful. So my Virgin Mary has a very much brighter sort of history, if you like, than the ones we've been looking at today. It's something I'd never thought of or noticed before. And it's linked, I think, just to the fact that most of the images that one finds around are models. They're ivory or made of white material. Whereas the ones I've been looking at, which have been in churches, have largely been ones that have been painted, they're frescoes. And then, of course, there's sort of and material and so on. And there's no problem with what you actually colour them. You can use whatever colour you like. So I'd be interested to hear your responses to the colours that I'll be showing you in my images and just see how you feel they might fit in, because to me, it's been the biggest surprise sitting through today. I just need to find my images now. Hang on a sec. I think I probably need to.
Are you okay, Eileen? Do you need some technical assistance? Do you need advice from Richard, Eileen, or are you okay? Eileen, your microphone's off.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yep.
Great. Okay, fine. Now I've got my first image here, and I just put it up on the screen. Can you see it?
You need to press share screen, which should be at the bottom of the...
Okay, brilliant, yes. Okay, share.
Here we go.
And if I can just get this one up.
Wonderful.
Is that it?
Well, you need to, that's it, we're away. Wonderful.
You're away, right, brilliant. Okay, well, I wasn't intending this to strike a particular moment, but it does seem to me this does strike a contrast, this particular image, which is only a fresco, but which is actually showing you the colour that we tend to get in the images of Mary that I tend to see in Rome and in the places that are linked with Rome, which strike me after listening to the talk today as quite different from the images that you've been looking at, which have largely been white, very beautiful, but very strikingly white. And what we've got here is an image which is actually of the Virgin Mary with two popes. These two figures down here with their square halos are two popes. She's also, of course, flanked by two angels. And she's got the Christ child sitting on her lap. She's got a crown, and she's got hair coming down to her chest as well. And she's holding a religious cross. So and then she's in a starry sky as well. You really can't get more sort of holy, I guess, than that. And it's really quite an interesting sort of style. When I saw that image, I thought I have to have that one and put it in with my others because it's just so striking. If one looks at the image, in fact, from where it comes from, it's figure 1D. So it's from the fresco in St. Nicholas's Chapel, which is part of the Lateran Basilica. So it's really right in the centre in Rome. And it is actually, it does actually sum up one of the wonderful things about Rome, in that it has so many people who are anxious to paint it and to actually draw attention to images of Mary, that you get a large number of them. It is actually quite rare to get two popes sitting at Mary's feet, but that's what we have in this particular one. this is really quite splendid, I think. The other late one over here, this is Mary as one part of the Roman sort of representations of Mary. But if we go back to the number C, we have really an image here which shows us what is being copied, because what we have here, in fact, is Empress Theodora, as in not so very dissimilar clothes, with a sort of crowned headdress in a similar way, it's the pearls scattered around and so on. And here again, we have, she is depicted in the sanctuary in San Vitale in Rome. So again, what we have here is a very decorated, very elite woman. And it's the eliteness, I think, of the way that Mary is looked at in the context of the work that I do, which never actually tastes of it. It's just what happened to come out from the churches I chose to look at. One is finding actually that you have here an image of Mary that is really quite different from that comes from the sort of the standard thinking of let's have a look and see what Mary does in one of those places. And so let's just have a look at there, for example, just ahead for a second of the various images, because again, the other thing that hasn't come up is any engagement of these people with things like gold coins. And here you've got a gold coin on it with an empress, Eudoxia, in the 5th century. But if you look at the similarities with, for example, a Mary here, or one here, which is Mary by Pope John VII, you can see again that it's this standard, this is the elite, the most elite, the most important lady depiction that we've got here. It's not so much something that's very holy, it seems to me it's much more something that's very important and powerful that is being depicted in these images. I won't go through them all because, but I think they are very striking, and I'm very fond of them for many reasons. But the other thing that you have in Rome, I think that actually helps with this sort of deification almost of Mary in a sort of strange reverse way, is of course that you've got the popes there, and the popes have significant amounts of money, and they are very powerful in terms of actually generating images of the Holy Family, and also putting themselves into those images. And that's another thing that I think is very striking about the way Rome particularly displays and deals with Mary. So here we have again, we have Mary here, who's wearing the sort of things that become standard, which is the sort of pearl bedecked decorations around the top of her body, often on her. And these, in fact, are not originally from Mary. They are originally coming from the sort of elite members of the church. And then you have also got, often down at the bottom, but really important, although they tend to be much more eroded, you've got Pope John VII, who's very fond of Mary, and he is actually kneeling down here. Now you're going to have to believe me here because it's very difficult to see, but I promise you, this is the back of John VII, and this is his eye just here. But what you can see, which is actually, I think, more informative and more important, is these bare spots around here and here and here, which are the signs of the worship of this Virgin Mary, in that they're where people have actually either washed space or with holy water, or have kissed areas to carry favour and to pass on wishes for information and for gifts or good things and so on. Also, of course, this Virgin Mary is seated on her lap here, the Christ child. He's got his uniform halo, you can just about see parts of it there. And in this one, he is unusually quite well dressed. Sometimes the baby Jesus is a little bit on the skimpy side with his clothes. And then Mary in the centre here is actually flanked by 2 angels out on the side. I always find a very satisfactory way of balancing out the image. And this is, in fact, we can even tell what this is actually used for, because this is almost certainly a panel that was processed, because you can see around the edge here there is an inscription which tells us that it is also an image that is alleged to be not made by human hands. And so it's actually supposed to be one that actually was made by angels and sort of delivered overnight. Seems to have been a great market in delivering images overnight, because there are quite a number of these not made by human hand images in Rome and in the environment. And this is what this one here is. But it is the other really interesting thing about it is, because of the paint that we have here, we can also see how it was worshipped and how it was actually sort of obeisance and power was awarded. Because in fact, what you also have here is places where the paint has been eroded away. So you can see just up here there's obviously Kate's gone, and you're just left with the wood underneath. And again down here, which is probably where his feet were, and this little bit of red probably is part of his feet. And therefore down here again, these areas are the places that are washed and then are worshipped and are kept as special places. So basically what one has got actually is a rather different approach to Mary in these images. It's not so much her virtue, it's more her power. And in a way, she seems to me to be being allied with the power of those who are the rulers and being seen in their light rather than seen in the light of the sort of holy Christians. Not that they're not overlapping, don't get me wrong about that. This is another image, this is one again, this is from Pope John VII again, I think. And here again, you've just got the same type of image. I just put this one up because it gives you a chance to see what her halo and her pendulia, these are called pendulia. They're the sort of drops of pearls and sometimes other image pieces of delivery of decoration that are there. And again, Mary quite often does have not these sort of usual hair, but she's got hair, these hair drifts, if you like, coming down either side. And then often the area around here and panels on either side of her shoulders, where it makes this sort of, and then perhaps a belt. And this would be the sort of standard, quite a standard sort of Mary if you're in Rome in those times. You've really got something here which is quite different, I would suggest, to anything that you've been showing me in other places. But if you've got similar representations anywhere in the places you've been working in, I would be really interested in seeing them. The other thing that happens here is in most of this art is from Rome, although not all of it, but another thing that is very closely happens here is that the various key players seem to interact with each other in really quite sort of cozy and friendly ways, again depicting them as if they're part of a holy family, if you like. And so here you've got Christ in the centre here, and then you've got Mary here holding a scroll. And in fact, this is actually really quite a secular thing to reaction, really, because what Christ's scroll says is here, we can read, "Come thou whom I have chosen, and I shall place thee on my throne." And Mary on her scroll, which is this one here, responds by saying, "His left hand will be under my head, and his right hand will encircle me." Now, these are actually quotes from the Bible, I think, or from religious texts. But it's quite interesting that they're used here not only to actually evoke quite sort of sexual aspect, but also that Christ has got his hand around Mary's shoulder. He's wearing a crown with pendulia coming down, and Christ has got his cruciform halo. So there's absolutely no doubt who we've got here. And they are there standing, sitting next to each other, as a really very much mimicking a holy couple. It's a sort of tense thing to have in the context of the asexual nature of Christ in most of the other areas, and even in asexual aspects of Mary's activities most of the time.
Eileen, can I just interrupt? We can't hear you very well. The sound quality is quite bad. I don't know whether it's possible for you to find a way of just, keeping an even distance from your microphone or something like that. But people are sending me messages to say they can't hear you.
They want me to come closer.
Oh, that's a bit better.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, is that better? Okay, fine. It's even easier to see it, so that's great. Thank you. Okay, fine. Sorry about that, but I hope you can see here. This is what we've got here is actually a very cozy relationship, and we've even got people at the side here peering in as well. If we now move on, just to have a look at more of these sorts of images, I think it's worth making the point that these images are not uncommon in Rome and in the West in this period, which is sort of mostly around the first millennium, the sort of 500 to 1,000, that sort of period. And basically what this is actually a fresco example, because the ones I've shown you so far have been usually jewellery and pieces of glass decoration and a metal frame. But this is actually from my church that I work on, Santa Maria Antiqua, and it's therefore from really quite early on, but it's a fresco that has been preserved. In fact, all we have in Santa Maria Antiqua is part of the image. So we don't have this area here. So this is a sort of PowerPoint miracle, if you like, that you can, this side is obviously the sort of complementary to the other side. So what I've done is flipped over a copy. So you can see that what you do have here again is Mary with a purple robe and with jeweled material around her bottom and down the sides here. She's holding the Christ child on her lap. She's wearing a crown, and so that's better here. She's wearing a crown with the pendulia, and the angels either side, this is one angel and this is another, are offering rich things to the Christ child in the centre and to Mary. And again, this is a symbolism that one sees quite a lot in Rome. This is a particularly nice example of it because it's been preserved. It was done in 700 or perhaps a little bit before that. And so it is quite old and was just a fresco. But because it's in the Church of Santa Maria Antiqua, it has continued to be in good condition over all this time. We now can look on to some...
Eileen, can I just interrupt you? People are still saying they can't hear you. A couple of them are saying perhaps you're too close to the mic. And so perhaps you need to be... When you first told me you'd moved, obviously I don't know exactly how you moved, the sound got better. But people are now saying it's as bad or worse. And they're saying, could you just... They suggest you move away from the mic.
Okay, I did move close to it. So
okay.
Is that any better?
For me at the moment, that is better.
Okay, well, I'll show
yeah, that is better.
Right ahead. Sorry about this.
Yeah.
Okay, so here, just to finish this little, so here we've got that fresco from about 700. And then basically what you have here is an image from Rome. And then what you've got here is actually an image of, it's not of Mary, but is actually an image of an empress. So basically what we have here is something from Constantinople. And she is dressed, again, in imagery that is not dissimilar from that of Mary. And again, what I think we are getting is really a complete melding of both whoever is important, if you like, is getting similar types of material. The quality is higher, of course. The empress here has got lots of pearls and a very substantial crown and earrings. And Mary in this one here is actually, in fact, this isn't Mary, this is actually, now what is this? This is actually Agnes, because she's got flames at the bottom. So she's just an ordinary angel, an ordinary saint. And she again is wearing the same style of clothes, symbols of what is happening to her, that she is in fact being martyred by being burnt. But again, the basic structure of these images is again very similar. The idea that there's a powerful person here, and they have power and they have money, and they are very holy and very important. And just to end up with one of an image of this, which you probably are familiar with. This is actually from San Vitale in Ravenna, which was, of course, the sort of centre of the Roman Empire at the period that this was done. It's a mosaic that was sent from the east after the Western Empire had been recovered from the eastern people who had actually taken it over by the battles by the emperor's battle in the east. And he then sent this mosaic panel or money probably for the mosaic panel to the west, to establish the fact that he had now become the emperor in the west of the Western Empire and was no longer just the emperor of the Eastern Empire. Here Mary is not present, but in fact we have the empress as the most elite figure here. But she's wearing again the very similar figures as images, decorations, but she also has here a rather more larger bunch of ladies to look after her needs. What is happening here is that the image, the empress is actually entering the church in San Vitale in Ravenna, and this is part of the taking over of the West by the Eastern Empire. It's not quite clear exactly what is happening here. Some people think that the Empress here, Theodora, died quite soon after this, and some people think that actually the idea of a black hole here, a black room that she's going into, is because although she's so sort of elite and so powerful, she is in fact going to still be dying within a few months. She dies, I think, of breast cancer, as far as we know from the sources. But on the other hand, we have here a small fountain, which actually is providing sustenance as well. So some of the signs here are rather different from what we would get elsewhere. And here we have her sort of retinue of ladies following behind her as well. just to show that you get this sort of imagery in all places, in all types, in all strengths, if you like, of art. Here we've got some, these are some frescoes. These are from the time of Pope Hadrian I, and they're showing the Virgin Mary enthroned, and she's got Maria Regina inscribed to the right of her head. So this is actually part of the lower level imagery that is in the Church of Santa Maria Antiqua, which is the church that I've done quite a lot of work on. And in this church, the imagery is really generated by the Pope, because the Pope seems to have largely been the one responsible for the decorations. They're mostly in fresco, which is interesting. There's, as far as we can see, there's no more expensive sort of gold jewellery or anything actually in Santa Maria Antiqua in these early periods. Although it's possible, of course, that some of it was stolen before we finally came around to look at this church. But what you have got here is actually a series of people with their halos, and what you've got again is a collection of the representatives of the power of this particular sort of object. So you've got a Pope, Hadrian I, the Queen, Maria Regina, it's Mary, and then another Pope here, Pope Sylvester I, and then you've got various people either side. And the Church of Santa Maria Antiqua has many of these panels identifying groups of people painted as frescoes and identifying the sorts of people who were important there. It's also quite important, I always find, although you may not think so, to notice actually that this actually tells you when people, what a halo with sort of imperial status looks like, because this little inscription here, which comes from down here, says that the imagery here is of a Maria Regina, or Mary the Queen, and it's the only time I think that we actually see the term Maria Regina, and it's near where these very elite headdresses are placed as well. So it is quite nice to be able to say we do know what that particular style of imagery was called, because actually it is actually written on this panel here. This panel is actually not in the body of the church. It's nearer to the outside, so it's more one that people might pass and look at and learn from, rather than one that they would actually feel what was part of the elite material that would be looked at in Rome. And if we now move on to a slightly even more elite image here, this is the Church of Santa Maria Maggiore, the Church of the Great Mary, and so the very sort of elite church would have been using lots of money to pay for it. It's made in mosaic tessera rather than any of these sort of frescoes. And it is actually a very, very nice depiction of Mary being crowned by Christ, and then of things happening, the sort of story of the life of Christians of that period. So in the center here, we have a cruciform halo over Christ. They're both seated on a quite elite, slightly unusual design throne, but a nice throne. There's a starry sky around them, and Christ is actually in the process of crowning Mary, who is sitting by the side of him and is actually sort of acknowledging the sort of compliment, if you like, with her hands. Either side, we've got swirls of just a general sort of decoration. We've got a starry sky here, which suggests that when I wrote a paper on this, I couldn't decide whether one should say this is of Mary and Christ going up into heaven, or of Christ and Mary coming down from heaven. The ambiguity there, I think, is sort of absolute. So this is traveling up or down to heaven that one has there. And then along the bottom here, you've got a series of holy people. They look for, as if given the background of the church, they're probably members of the Church of Rome at that period. But also here have a bit that most people don't notice. It's actually linking into the back of the apse of the church. And here you actually can see the soul of Mary passing up from down here up through into heaven at the top. So this is actually a sort of representation of the death, and then the sort of decoration of Mary when she gets up into heaven, which is actually quite an unusual thing to see here. This is a very big apsidal area, and the Church of Maria Maggiore is really a very nice church to go and look at, because it does still have quite a lot of mosaics that are still telling these stories. There are more of them along here. You can see this is another mosaic panel with another story from the Bible along the bottom here. Now here we've got actually a rather less well surviving piece of material. This is a fresco from the Theodora Chapel at Santa Maria Antiqua. So these are again more frescoes. The thing about Santa Maria Antiqua is that it basically have a few pieces of gold or jewellery was placed in it, but mostly it was decorated with frescoes. And I think that's because Pope John VII, who mostly ran the church, was not a particularly well-off Pope. Most of what he does seem to have done was within a reasonable budget, if you like. And so basically what he was doing was using frescoes. And frescoes, quite importantly, have actually mostly survived. But of course, they do seem to be affected by the geometry and the origins of the imagery. So the reason we've got no imagery here is because this is actually part of the lunettes in the centre that would have had a more important part of the decoration there. But either side here, you've got images of saints on either side here, so that you can see that is important. But what you have lost, in fact, is Mary's head here. But it's important to recognise, you can probably be sure it is Mary's head, because what you've got here is really very clearly a nice firm standing chair or place to sit. You've got these pinky red sides of the cushion, and red cushions were a pretty sure sign of being very powerful and very important. And then, of course, you've got what you can see at the top here. You've got the image. You can't see the images in the centre, but you can look at the images either side and see how they sort of pass in to tell you about the imagery of its own. It's really quite challenging working on these sorts of images because you don't often have much in the way of writing what's written down. But if you get to know the signs of the imagery and what things look like and what happens in other places, say Constantinople or maybe Ravenna, you often can work out exactly what's happening. And that makes it really quite a challenge, but quite satisfying when you found out what you managed to determine what is being depicted here. This is just a quick show you the plan of the Church of Santa Maria Antiqua, to give you some idea of what a church at that period, it was about 700 or 800, would have been about. This would have gone on for some time afterwards, so I wouldn't base anything on the basis of it, but the initial outline was around that time. So basically what you tend to have is a central, an actual holy space at the top here with a little conch at the end here. And that would be your most holy spot. There often would be little smaller chapels either side. This one on the side here, G, is actually, I believe, is actually where those who were sick and wanted to actually talk to a saint and see if the saint would help them to get better, would come and stay overnight, often sleeping somewhere in this area here, which is basically full of images of healing and how to improve your, and how things like that can be aided. So you basically have here probably an area which is sort of part of a sort of a small place where people could come to be cured. If they couldn't be cured, they may of course wanted to be helped by being sort of looked after. And quite a lot of the area in this big area at the bottom here, which actually originally was outside, it's quite a lot of the areas here seem to have possibly been taken over at later dates to actually be used to actually look after people who were coming there, not more as pilgrims, perhaps when they're sick, but often then requiring some sustenance. And there is a very small place. It's not actually shown very well on here, but it's out here. It is a very small area, which appears to me to have a smaller, a sort of supportive area where children, mothers could give birth. Because of the way things are organised there. There's actually a little picture of the Christ child to one side. So as the mother is giving birth, you can look at the picture and give her prayers to God at the same time. It's really quite a nice little, only a fresco, nothing very special, but quite a nice insight on what people wanted and believed in at that time. Now we've just looked at imagery in the context really of humans looking at big and important areas, but in fact, of course, quite a lot of the sort of, if you like, the money that passed or the power that passed with the more senior people would be by sending images with pictures of people on the sides of them. And this is actually a cross which was called the Cross of Justine II, who was an emperor, and actually the emperor in the East sent this cross to the Pope. and it has the depictions of the various key people. So you've got the lamb in the center here, you've got an image of Christ here, and you've got vertical arms on the cross here, saying with prayers going down to God from the various areas. So basically what you've got here again is a mixture of blessings and people lying down and giving sort of prayers, sometimes asking for things, sometimes actually saying that they've been supported by somebody more powerful. So this gold cross, which is still, I think, in St. Peter's, you can see it, I think, in one of the old chapels there, is actually sort of concretely stating the fact that the emperor in the east by then, this time, so the Constantinopolitan emperor and the emperor in Rome, or the people who represented the emperor in Rome, who probably wasn't the emperor by then, were of the same mind and were supporting each other. And that's the sort of imagery that you're getting here. Now here we've got, this is from the Church of Santa Maria Antiqua, and this is where Pope John VII inserted his decoration to actually identify when he had first got hold of the Church of Santa Maria Antiqua. And so this was, he gets the Church of St. Peter's. So basically what he's looking at here is actually, I've now got the Church of St. Peter's, and I'm going to mark this with somewhere where I'm going to die eventually. And he was only Pope for 7 years, so although he looks quite young, he obviously was probably not very well. So basically what we have in the centre of this panel, which actually you can see if one goes down into the underground areas in St. Peter's, but it's not easy to see. But this is a painting of it. It's not in as good condition as this. But what you've got here is an image of Mary with her hands up in a blessing, and you've got the Pope at the side here. So you've managed to get the Pope feeling he can actually directly relate to Mary with her halo. And then around the edge here, Pope John has actually put a series of images from the story of Christ and various aspects of the birth, and then the various events, things that happen with Christ once he's born and as he becomes more and more powerful. This is actually the mosaic is still surviving, and this is the little bit of the Pope on the side with his square halo and Mary with her circular halo. But the fresco around the outside is no longer surviving, but we do have these pictures which were drawn earlier on, and we also do have one or two sort of drawings of our own that means you can look at them. But they basically are just telling you the story of the early part of the sort of generation of the Christian story. And here we're looking at, we're now looking at Santa Maria in Trastevere and the act in Santa Maria in Trastevere. And I've chosen this one because it's actually really quite a sort of standard one. It gives you a chance to actually see how this sort of the organisation again. In the centre, you've got really what I usually call the path up to heaven, because usually what you're thinking of is that Mary or Christ will come down from heaven and come past through this area here, probably carried through by the angels. The angels were seen as Christ's sort of transmission service, the ones that would actually take him from one place to another. And so Christ would come down and through this area here, which is often, what you see in the centre here is often a sort of central area that looks as if it's sort of very richly decorated, but doesn't have any people in it. And then you've got the mosaic coming around here of the actual the sides of the act. And then you've got a procession of people going around here, which are the people that you want to actually engage with or ask favours of from in the act that you're generating. So what you have here is Christ with his cruciform halo, and he's got Mary to his right. He may, and I'm not quite sure whether he's got his arm around her or not, but he's certainly sitting quite close to her, and she is offering her hands to him in some way, some sort of conversation going on there, which is a standard central area, would be the area where you're seeing holy people, people who are not just human people. Beyond that, you then will get a series of images of people who are important in the local churches, and they will be named. So that along the bottom here, you've got names often of people that are rather relevant people. And then beyond that, you have the Lamb of God, and then lambs representing the apostles, the disciples or the apostles, and on the bottom quite often. So you've got a whole series of meanings engaged into an act. And these meanings can be flexed and modified to make sure that to send the message that you want. But if you're a pope or a king, an emperor in the East, they do provide you with a wonderful chance to do a great deal of giving and asking, probably quite cheaply if you're very well off and have good links with the mosaicists. It's interesting about mosaic work in Rome because, in fact, it doesn't look as if the West was ever able to sustain a mosaic industry.
Eileen, can I just say you're over time? Can you wind up? Yeah,
I'll wind up in a minute. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So it's important. What you can do then is sustain the imagery by looking at how you're looking at it, how it's going, and putting in the images you want, but leaving out things that you don't want. I'll just go to this last one here, because I think more or less at the end, and that brings you back to this image, which is the one I showed you at the beginning, which just shows you the sort of mass of iconography that you get, but not in the standard sort of white and pale colours, where Mary is actually seen as central, almost more commonly, more importantly than Christ himself. So here you've got Mary at the top with her crown and her halo, Christ with his halo here, which would be a cruciform one almost certainly, angels with their wings and with cruciform sort of handles that they're holding, and then people, popes. The Pope, who's most important to people in Rome, not actually at the top of the image, but actually on the floor, at the floor, nearly at the feet of Mary. And you can see here that he's actually touching the feet. They both are touching the feet of Mary. Feet are often quite important in this context. And I'm going to, that's my last picture, in fact. I'm just going to say this, just because it's actually a later picture, and I think it's actually a more honest picture, if you like. It's more real. It's not easy to see, and I thought it's worth just showing you that in fact it can be just human people with human imagery, no great florals and things. And those also can be depicted in some places when you see them. You see here, he still manages to get quite a nice cushion as well. So I'm going to finish there, and of course happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you, Eileen. Although the sound was sometimes not good.
Ooh. She's slightly annoying, the woman who tells us that we're being recorded, but there you are.
The timing's out.
Yes. Well, no. I've just turned the recording on.
Okay.
Okay. Well,
no,
it's 4 o'clock.
Okay. No share screen thing yet.
Are more or less ready to rumble. You don't have a share screen thing, did you say?
No.
Okay. If you hover the mouse along the bottom of your screen.
Okay. I'm going to have to do that.
Good. Yeah. Right. Welcome back, everybody, to this afternoon of Ora Pro Nobis, and it's been a tremendous day. The papers today have given ample testimony to Kathy's generosity and the inspiration that her teaching and her scholarship have inspired. And we continue today with John McNeill, who is the Secretary of the British Archaeological Association, and as such has been the moving force behind many of the best initiatives of the association. He has taught at the Oxford University Department of Continuing Education and is widely acknowledged as the leading connoisseur of decorated voussoirs. His paper today is The Virgin in the Chapter House, the life and times of a carved relief in Saint-Aubin in Angers. John.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. And I'm sorry to be so sort of cumbersome with this, but I can't because of the upper toolbar here.
Okay, go down to the bottom, John.
Right.
Go to your right. You will find the end. There's a thing that looks like a screen just next to the volume control.
Oh, yeah.
Wiggle your pointers, hit that.
Lovely.
And you're away. Good.
Fantastic.
Okay.
Richard, you're a star. Thank you very much.
I will shut up.
Well, I'm going to take you into the cloister. It's time to invite you into the cloister. And what I'd like to talk about is an image of the Virgin and Child. in a bay adjacent to the chapter house entrance at Saint-Aubin in Angers. And I'll show you more of that in a moment. But the image in question is actually up here on the screen as a title slide. And the reason really for choosing this as a subject is twofold. On the one hand, it was something which I spoke about with Kathy. She wrote about it, and she included a couple of pages really, both on this image and on Saint-Aubin more generally in her book on Romanesque churches of the Loire Valley and Western France. But also it struck me that it touches on issues of images and narrative. And my ideas are not entirely fully formed about this. So this is really rather tentative. But what I'm going to try to persuade you and possibly myself is that the sculpture is not coeval with the painting. The painting was added sometime later, about a generation later, in a way which fundamentally altered the way in which this image was seen. And that therefore narrative or even performative elements were introduced into what previously was an image of the Virgin as Queen of Heaven, to use one of Krautheimer's desiderata for reflections of the Pantheon, or in the phraseology of Western French monasticism, or French monasticism really, in the 12th century, the Empress of Heaven. So Peter the Venerable talks about the Virgin as Imperatrix Caelorum Dominatrix Angelorum, the Empress of Heaven and Lord of the Angels. And Geoffrey Vendôme, and Angevin himself, in fact, and Abbot of Vendôme, writing again in the early 12th century, talks about Laudabilis Universalis Imperatrix Angelorum et Hominum, the praiseworthy and universal ruler of angels and men. And this is fundamentally, I think, what the image that you see is about from a sculptural point of view. And this is the sort of larger context. And so what you see here is a tympanum subdivided by two arches, and then a single large bounding arch.
This one seems to be based on the action.
Hello. Thank you very much. A single large bounding arch, and the bounding arch has a series of angels, which in a very Western French sort of manner are for the most part paired. And so, let me think here. No. So you get inward pairings of angels who are sort of variously either standing, kneeling, holding elements, or occasionally sort of shuffling in an almost sort of Groucho Marx-like way here. And a total of 4 foliate voussoirs, as you see here, here, and just over here. And within the tympanum itself, then an angel within a type of figure of 8 or double mandorla, which is held as a physical object by 2 angels just here. And as far as the imagery itself is concerned, then the angels actually form a sort of bounding arch, which is clearly intended to be read in tandem and very closely related to the image of the Virgin herself. It's even possible, with such a famously sort of floribundant figure as the Virgin, that the 4 little foliate voussoirs you see here might also be intended to be read symbolically, as in Anselm's address to the Virgin, in which he calls her a rod of the tree of Jesse, a cedar of Lebanon, a purple rose of Jericho, a cypress of Mount Sion. The actual image itself is, as I said, adjacent to the chapter house entrance over here. And this view, as you can see, reveals there's actually quite a lot going on in the East Cloister Walk at Saint-Aubin, which is worth saying a little bit about before proceeding. The cloister now forms part of the Hôtel du Département in Angers. a fact which I suspect has contributed to its not being as well known as it probably ought to be. And it was uncovered as the result of work towards the extension of this area into the Cordon in 1836, and subsequently it was abandoned. This idea actually of extending out to the west of the cloister, and the floor level was lowered here, so you can see these steps over on the left-hand side to approximately the level, the original floor level of the east walk of the cloister. And it was at some point, probably in the 15th century, vaulted. And so the scarring that you can see here on the wall relates to the late medieval vaults, at which point much of this also was probably plastered over, though they still use the chapter house entrance here, albeit with an internal arch, and albeit narrowed as such. And as a result of its 1836 discovery, it entered the list of protected monuments historiques, and was fated, it was the subject of one of the very first articles to be written in the Bulletin Monumental, in fact. And Valérie Godard-Fautrier, who's the archivist for the new department of Maine-et-Loire, wrote up the east walk of the cloister at that point. And there's an internal sort of dynamic and momentum as far as the arrangement of forms here is concerned. It consists of a total of 6 arches here on the right-hand side of the chapter house opening, and 6 arches which are with a very different treatment on the left-hand side of the opening. And it belongs to a larger tradition of chapter house design. So this is a plan of it, you can see here. So this is the chapter house entrance itself. These are the 6 southern arches, which are subdivided into pairs. These are the 6 northern arches, which are arranged as 3 triplets with a total of 24 columns between each of these triplets just here. And this sacristy was created round about 1700 during the Moorish reform. So you need to think that away. And the rear wall of the chapter house is approximately here. It was actually uncovered in the 1950s. So it's a large rectangular chapter house here with a low wooden ceiling, probably actually quite dark, forming part of an irregular a cloister arrangement, the refectory being here. Subsequently, in the 1850s, the refectory portal was discovered just down here as part of a significantly later phase of work in the building. And the overall facade is very much like this. So you can see better this division of 6 an opening and then 6 more arches. The larger tradition in which this lays is now best represented really by chapter houses like Charlieu. And these come out of what, as far as we can see, is a Cluniac tradition of chapter house design, something which had much more impact locally than it did across Europe in Cluniac houses, hence the survival here of Charlieu. And they come out of ultimately the arrangements at Cluny too. One aspect of these very open chapter house facades is the chapter house themselves frequently give on to a Marian Chapel, a Lady Chapel. So you can see here in Conant's plan of Cluny 2 that the rear wall off-centered towards the church side, towards the north side here, actually has an opening which then took you into the oratory or Oratoire Sainte Marie, as it's called here, but a chapel dedicated to the Virgin. This is where they say the necrology. So the Virgin becomes very closely associated with prayers for the dead, and by extension, of course, with intercession. Although it's not really clear on this plan, you can just about make it out. The chapter house entrance is off-centered, as originally it was at Charlieu. And we know about the arrangement of arched entries here through 2 sets of descriptions, one of which are extremely detailed, which give the measurements, in fact, in the so-called Farfort consuetudinary, which is essentially a description. It's both a customary and it's a description of the arrangements at Cluny in the early 11th century. It dates from about sort of 1030, 40 type of period before the new church, before what we know as Cluny III was actually built. And it tells us very specifically that there were 12 openings, 12 arches, in fact, which gave onto the chapter house interior, and that these were subdivided by pairs of columns. And it's that that really lies behind Saint-Auban, sort of souped up, massively enriched as an overall chapter house design. Step into Charlieu, you can still see the opening or the entrance here into what was the Lady Chapel, now off-centre towards the left. Previously, there was more behind this blocking wall as well. So there was a little bit of the east wall of the chapter house, and therefore seating to the left of this entrance here at Charlieu. In terms of the arrangement of sculpture here, then there is a sort of momentum which you have as you move. It drives you really from from south to north, or processionally towards the church rather than away from the church itself. And the individual subjects, insofar as we can actually make them out, are respectively David with Goliath in the tympanum, organized in 3 scenes. So you see David with his sling here with Goliath. You then see David towering over Goliath, Goliath having been killed, and then David presents the head of Goliath to Saul, as you see here on the left. And the voussoirs, now damaged, seem somewhat disorderly. There are also repeat voussoirs here of foliate scenes, and then with one voussoir cannot be reconstructed, but the others suggest that 11 were figurative, and the majority of those, 8 of those, are labours of the month. They're not organised in a clockwise or anti-clockwise monthly order. As such, they seem somewhat sort of disrupted from that. The middle order, the middle pair, rather, has a series of repeats, a very Western French sort of arrangement. Western French voussoir construction favours rhythm, and it favours repeats. It works on a modular system, essentially, in which repeats of the discipline of repeats, symmetries and asymmetries, are really very important. And it reaches a certain level of sophistication in which you can start to find offbeat elements, singular pieces that are thrown into the voussoirs, and indeed into the capitals. The capitals relate to this as well. As far as the voussoirs are concerned, then these are all warriors who face inwards and appear to be almost slugging it out, really, in some sort of combat. And set within that, there is a figure who is either being pursued by or is simply running from this dragon-like creature, this sort of serpent-like creature here. What happens on the left-hand side, obviously, we can't reconstruct now, given the damage that's been caused by the vaulting of this, but it looks as if it divides into 2 scenes as such, as distinct from the 3 scenes that you actually have on the right-hand arrangement. And the figure is moving from right to left towards the chapter house entrance. And then you have the chapter house entrance itself, which you've already seen, in which again we get largely paired repeats in the voussoirs, in this case of angels, and these 4 foliate voussoirs sort of thrown into it, 3 of them on a left-hand or chapter house entrance bias. I used to toy with the idea there might be something about estates actually going on here, with sort of angels standing in for the religious, for the monastic, and the military, for those who pray, those who fight, and those who work, with the labours of the month standing in for that. I'm sort of less attached to that notion now. And as far as the capitals are concerned, then they are really quite disciplined. They may not look it, but they are. The key is the way in which you get these pairings here of winged creatures with cockerel-like heads to them. So that as you move from right to left, you find that these are used in part as framing devices. So there are 5 capitals with outer faces towards you, every one of which presents a different design. In the outermost pair of arches, when you move into the center, what you find is that the outer capitals are pairs and the inner 3 capitals are not. And when you move into the innermost arch, what you find is that both the outer and the middle capitals here are paired with a sort of single capital facing outwards towards the center. Or in other words, what you move is, what happens is you move from busyness, lots of different motifs as far as the capitals are concerned, to symmetry and stillness as far as the arch towards the actual chapter house entrance is concerned. I think that's deliberate, although there's a lot about the actual individual. There's a lot of confusion between the sculpture being made and it being fitted into the actual east walk of the cloister. It's particularly apparent around the chapter house, where it's very clear that the design was changed, that the chapter house entrance is actually lowered, and some of the sculpture was treated really quite brutally in that process. But I think that the people putting the sculpture in, the layers and setters, either were given very strict instructions as to this, or they simply understood the use of repeats when it came to the arrangement for the actual capitals there. And the chapter has the image of the Virgin here within this figure of 8 mandorla, also sort of invites a certain amount of comment. It's a very frontal arrangement in which the Christ child is being offered towards you, but with a right hand, a right arm here being held in blessing. These are the hands of the Virgin that are sort of securing Christ. And despite the fact that this mandorla here is organized as a figure of 8, the Virgin is very clearly seated. You can see that in the projection of the knees just here, but there's no visible means of support other than the mandorla. There's no enthronement as such. The Virgin herself is the throne, or the sort of sedes sapientia. I mean, she herself is wisdom. And this is something which is more generally shared in these figure of 8 types of mandorla, which seem to be emerging in the late Carolingian period. There's a big André Graybar article about it produced in the 1950s, in which he really sort of drew attention to this and drew attention to how it is that the trappings of divinity are effectively being extended in various different ways. This is something you got in Aelfwin's prayer book, which Theresa Lane was talking about earlier. In Western France in particular, it's really very widely used. And so at Montoire, to see here, we actually find 2 different images of Christ within one of these double mandorla, again with these very, very high knees, but with no enthronement as such. It even turns up in the Saint-Aubin Bible, illuminated at Saint-Aubin by a named painter, by Fulk here, who was rewarded with a house and a vineyard, and who produced other painting for the monastery in the 1080s and 1090s. And this is the image in this unfortunately rebound manuscript, very grand Bible from Saint-Aubin. And here at Bayeux Cathedral, this is one of 5 capitals that were fished out of the crossing piers in the 19th century, the sort of later 19th century, when again you can see this cross-limbed figure, sort of God Christ here with a childlike figure on the lap, which has been interpreted as an image, the reception essentially of the Virgin at the Assumption, by analogy with a capital which shows Thomas by the side of Christ, placing his hand in Christ's side, the missing link being Thomas then receiving the girdle of the Virgin at the Assumption. So you may buy that or you may not. It's a speculative image, but it makes a sort of basic point. These things come without enthronement. The actual lower section of the mandorla tends visually to be used as a type of a support. You have this high-kneed, seated figure here, and increasing extension of forms into it. So that's the sort of background. I can grab the compositional background really to this. All of this fits into the late 1120s and the early 1130s. I used to think on purely stylistic grounds, and there are very good parallels, some of which point towards particular dates. The dating of Western French Romanesque sculpture is a house of cards. Ultimately, we have very, very few dates that actually mean anything as far as the sculpture is concerned. But insofar as there is a consensus, an emerging consensus really, which came about in the sort of 1980s, 1990s, then this is very much the sort of period in which this belongs. And then about 5 years ago, Jean-Yves Huneau started to look at some of the timber which survived from the original daughter roof, the dormitory roof, the first story, upper story here. And he came across enough material to get a felling date for it. And the felling date was 1129, 1130 for it. So it fits very much, very rather comfortably into that, into a period which follows on from the reconstruction of the monastic church, something which climaxes in a major translation in 1128 of the relics of Saint-Aubin in the company of the counts of Anjou, or rather in the company of Fulk, Count of Anjou, and his son, Geoffrey, better known as Geoffrey Plantagenet. And Saint-Aubin, I should have probably mentioned this, is the sort of major comital Benedictine monastery in Angers. What happens subsequently, I think, is that this image, which ultimately strikes me as being intercessionary and actually related to the monks in chapter and their passage into chapter, is transformed in a way that draws attention to the incarnation. And it's transformed through the painting on the inner arches. There's no other figurative painting here. And although the chapter house portal was actually painted, it was painted with an architectural pattern. There's no painting at all on the inner arches of the other two. It's very high quality painting. And what now looks like a very dark black background here, in fact, is lapis lazuli, or rather it's lapis lazuli or minium. They're using these very deep pigments as the basis for the painting itself, because the architecture arranges it thus. Then the actual subject matter is organized into essential sections. So we have the journey of the Magi here on the right, and the Magi before Herod. Then you have Herod with his armiger here, the massacre of the innocents, and the actual adoration and the offering of gifts to Christ occupies this area. So it's organized on a left to right basis. And then on a white ground here, we actually have an architectural construction of building with a very firmly closed pair of doors that relates, or is generally related to Ezekiel's porta haute closer. This is the description of the new temple of Jerusalem in Ezekiel, in which he talks about how it was that the outer door, having been entered by God, should remain locked. And this is seen as an eminal prefigurational type for the virgin birth and for the fact the virgin remains a virgin after the birth of Christ. And it features in a number of poetic homilies some of which are in the library, or were in the library at Saint-Aubin. There's actually a 12th century library inventory survives from Saint-Aubin, quite a lot, about 300 medieval manuscripts from Saint-Aubin are now in the Bibliothèque Municipale in Angers. And in this is one of the sermons of Hildebert de Laverdin. Hildebert de Laverdin is local. I mean, he's from Angers. He becomes Bishop of Le Mans, very reluctantly is made Archbishop of Tours as well. He writes a series of homilies which are presented here to Angers. And the sermon for the Feast of the Assumption actually talks about this, and he talks about the inner gate is God the Father, and in the sanctuary dwells the Word which was in the beginning. The outer gate is the Blessed Mary, through whom we accomplish the forgiveness of our sins, thanks to the mystery of the Incarnation. Now, as far as the date of this painting is concerned, I'm on sort of slightly tricky ground here, because it's very difficult to find decent parallels for it, and most of its sort of compositional tricks you can find at the beginning of the 12th century, but taken together, then most of this really looks mid-century. It doesn't look sort of 1120s, 1130s. It looks third quarter of the 12th century. The two most recent commentators on this, Eric Palazzo and Christian Davy, have essentially tried to push the sculpture as late as they can and bring the painting as early as they can in order to sort of unify the two in the round about 1150. But if you actually look at this arrangement of figures, particularly in terms of these rather congealed figure groupings, these extremely elegantly attired women, or elegantly presented women, the mothers, in the Massacre of the Innocents, and the tendency also to show the villains in profile, particularly if they're functionaries, if they're soldiers or advisors to Herod. All of that tends to point towards a date in the 1150s or the 1160s, and you can find some decent parallels for these, though not local parallels. Unfortunately, nothing in the library of Saint-Aubin really compares closely to it. But if that's so, if actually we're looking at a transformation, injection of a narrative into an image which was essentially monastic and intercessionary, then there's a question of a trigger for it. And what might that trigger actually be? And this is slightly more difficult and certainly much more speculative. But one possibility is there's a second translation of Saint-Aubin into a capsule. It's the head of Saint-Aubin, in fact. Again, it's another comital attended translation in 1151. It's followed by a decision on the part of Robert de la Tour-Landry, who is abbot at Saint-Aubin, to accord the Feast of the Assumption the same processional importance as Easter, Pentecost, and Christmas. Although we don't know exactly how that actually translates, we do know that in processions around the cloister, certain particular processions, and I suppose the most important here were with the Feast of the Epiphany, that in fact there was a cloister procession and that a responsory was sung during that cloister procession. And the responsory was from Regis Targus, the kings of Tarsus and the island shall offer presents. Well, this is actually quite common. I mean, many monasteries do this on the Feast of the Epiphany. There's nothing sort of special about it. But if that was so, then this would be a specific location within the cloister where there may have been a pause within a cloister procession. There might be something performative, in other words, about what's happening here in this transformation. And on that sort of speculative note, I see I've overrun, so I will finish there. Thank you, Richard.